Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. Come on in. Come on in. Join us this morning. We are really glad that you are here, really honored to have the time. We're a minute or two past 9 and get everybody in and settled in. It's a wonderful morning and a great time to be together. We hope that you are well this morning. There's a great buzz in the air, and that's a good thing, and we're thankful to share the time and share the occasion together with you and yours. Welcome to our Bible class and to the Church of Christ and Champions. If you're a guest or a visitor this morning, why, it's about time you showed up. We've been waiting on you. We are thankful that you're here. Thanks for being a part of our morning together today. We're thinking about many folks this morning on our hearts and minds, while later on we'll update you on those that are near and dear to us and keep them in our thoughts and prayers and give you the latest news that we have on them. But for now, we're just glad to see you all for our time together and study. We've been working through the last couple of Sundays, and this Sunday and next we'll conclude out a series that we've entitled When We Come Together. And we're thinking about the body of the church as we navigate aspects of growth, as with growth comes at times and at moments challenges or maybe even conflict. And then with all of those things, you don't have those things unless you have people present. And so we're thinking about the church as a body. And when she comes together, the challenges that she faces, the obstacles that can be hers to navigate or to endure or to overcome, it doesn't mean necessarily anything other than we are people. And as a result, when we come together as people, we're going to have those occasions or those opportunities for difficulty or distress or even disagreement. How do we navigate that? The Bible's not silent to that. The Bible is very clear and I think very incredibly insightful when it comes to those aspects of the body and of the growth of the body. And so we think about from the beginning how these things have been addressed in Scripture and what that concept of how to handle these aspects looks like, what it resembles, and what it can mean for you and for me as we navigate these things. We started off a couple of weeks ago looking at the idea of the church in her earliest days growing, and her growth was explosive to say the least, and it was exponential. As she began to grow, and truly only words like multiply or exceeding multitudes were fitting to describe the nature of the growth of the early church. But as she grew, she started experiencing difficulty. It wasn't a sign necessarily that what she was doing was wrong. It was just a sign of what she was doing was in keeping with what happens when you bring more people together in one place. You begin to encounter difficulty and struggle. Opportunity for conflict can arise. And certainly that's what we see very early on in the nature of the church. One of the earliest opportunities for conflict we don't have listed was found in Acts chapter 1 when the 12 come together in the upper room, and there you have ultimately the 120, but in the midst of all of those individuals you have Mary, the mother of Jesus. Think about the early conflict that could have existed there as all of these individuals at some point in time or another turned their back on her son, and the potential for conflict that such an event, an encounter like that could be. But the church navigated through it. You find the church praying together in Acts chapter 1. You find the church continuing her plan of God in Acts 1, preparing for the future that would lie ahead. So you see the reality of conflict sitting in, but it doesn't necessarily upend the entirety of the whole body. You find conflicts like the divided distribution. The church was overlooking a group of her own in the daily distribution of needs. Acts chapter 6. Well, that wasn't acceptable. And so they appealed to leadership. How do we help resolve this? They were divided over people. They were divided over Saul of Tarsus, or the Apostle Paul as we would eventually know him. They were divided over these personalities and these people in their presence. And so how do we navigate certain people? Well, they appealed to leadership in Acts chapter 9 to navigate that problem. There was a divide over doctrine. What are the things that we should be teaching? Should we be teaching people to go and be circumcised after they've obeyed the gospel? Should we be teaching people to observe principles or aspects of the old law? Well, they divided over that. And so the leaders were appealed to for their leadership in this moment. How do we handle that kind of divide? Over and again, you see this aspect where division is a reality, but the appeal to leadership is the benefit through that division. How do we navigate? How do we overcome? And how do we negotiate these difficulties? We looked at a text in 1 Corinthians 11, how the church at Corinth was a church that was just fraught with problem and controversy and difficulty and issue and aspects of division. She was just full of problems. Why was she full of problems? Well, she was full of people. That's why she was full of problems. That's why the church at Corinth had so many problems, because she had so many people. And as a result, when all of these people came together, they brought with them their problems. They forgot to leave them at home. And as a result, it just touches everybody in every way. You think about the problems that were there. The problems were present because they were coming together. When they came together, they brought their problems with them. Part of the problem that they encountered was that they were divided. There were partitions among the people in terms of groups segmenting off from other groups. There were personality problems in the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians 11 talks about those who came together and they grouped themselves from one another in distinction of personality. There were the haves, there were the have-nots. There were those that were to be highly regarded. There were those that were not highly regarded. These were personality conflicts. And as a result, it led to some pretty presumptive thoughts and pretty presumptive concerns and considerations. Paul made this presumption: because of all of these things are true in the church, do you despise the church of God? I mean, if this is the way that you're going to behave, the presumption was you must hate God's church. Oh, man, what a severe accusation to levy against someone or a group of people in any circumstance or scenario. Paul would not just end there with the presumption. He would prescribe for them the prevention. I mean, here's how you deal with this. Here's how you navigate these kinds of problems. The prevention was pretty clear: the coming together in communion around the Lord. Pursue the Lord in all things, seek Him in every aspect, make Him the object of all your endeavors. When you pursue Him in all of these regards, that becomes the means of prevention. This is the matter by which we might overcome and deal with and negotiate and navigate through these difficulties. The idea of prevention was seen, I think, very beautifully in 1 Corinthians 11:24. Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. So when you come together, this ought to be your focus. Later on in the text, he says in verse 25, the very next verse, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. Later he goes on to say, whosoever drinks this cup or eats this bread in an unworthy manner drinks judgment or eats judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. You're not even thinking about the Lord, much less the body of His church or of His people. And so Paul says, let a man so examine himself every time he is in partaking of communion. If I'm thinking about my life in relationship to the Lord, and if I'm thinking about my life in relationship to the Lord, and by extension in relationship to you, some of the issues and the aspects of how we negotiate and navigate through problems or difficulties will become less, and we will navigate them in a better fashion. So we've covered a couple of observations in terms of what we do when we come together, how we navigate these issues and these trials. We looked at a series of some of the top 15, and they're pretty embarrassing, really, when you stop and think about everything from who gets to use a crock pot to what do we do in terms of hanging lockers in the ladies' restroom. Should the worship leader wear shoes or not wear shoes? How long is his beard? Do we hang a clock here, a picture of Jesus there, etc., etc., etc.? If the mind can conceive something, we can fuss and squabble about it. And so the reality is we've got to truly be focused in our mind and in our pattern of thinking as to what the difference ought to be. Anytime we're trying to confront something, too, that requires a level of change or even confront ourselves to the extent that we're made somewhat uncomfortable, we've got to give consideration as to how that approach is taken. So we've observed two things in our time together over the last couple of weeks. Number one is the consideration and the encouragement to stop and pray. The idea of seeing that this is an issue or seeing that this is a problem. What will we do in the presence of this issue, or what will we do in the presence of this problem? Well, will we stop and pray over this matter? Will we confront it and communicate a sense of urgency? Will we enlist the help and the aid of others to journey along with us in this process? You know, it dawns on me that in our own church family, in our season of transition, and there's a lot of of transition going on. If you stop and think about it, over the last 5 to 6 years, this congregation has remained in a state, if you will, of transition from your leadership to your ministry staff to other aspects involved in our church family. You have seen transition take place in a number of ways, from your elders to your deacons to your ministry staff and beyond, over the last 5 to 6 years. It's been calculated and added up, and if you stop and consider it, it really is significant. What if just consider this, in transitions that are coming ahead and transitions that lie in the future, what if there were a group of individuals that committed themselves to praying over all of those matters? What if there were 5, 10, 15, 20 people that said, you know what, until this aspect is fulfilled or completed, I'm going to pray for this every day. If this is going to be something that we're going to engage in doing, I'm going to commit myself to praying for that every day. Think about the kind of influence that aspect alone can have. Think about it too, if you're in a place where you think, well, I can't get out like I once was able to. I can't go and see people like I was once able to. Maybe I don't have the financial means to support some other work or some other effort like I once did. Maybe I'm on a fixed income. Maybe I'm just not able to engage in the way that I used to engage before. Do you still pray? I mean, can you still pray? Are you able to pray? And think about the nature of that. It's not a leftover type of appeal that we make to God. It really is essential. And then we think about confronting it with that sense of urgency, eliciting the idea of helping others to come in. We said last time when we were together that idea of stopping and praying was to pray for specific things. Pray for wisdom, what do we do? Pray for courage, how do we handle these aspects? Pray for strength, not my strength, but God's strength. Pray for discernment. I can't lean on my own understanding, but I can lean on God's understanding, and therein find a greater clarity and a greater purpose. How do we effectively engage in that notion of prayer? It makes this aspect come to life and makes it a reality of overcoming the hurdle. Nehemiah was the backdrop that we used in thinking about stopping to pray. He's a beautiful example, and it paints a beautiful picture of the idea of how to communicate urgency, but also saturating change and struggle and trial with prayer. Nehemiah is held captive. He's now employed in the king's court. He is tasting and taking care of many of the foods and drink that come to the king, and Nehemiah has a close personal relationship with the king. Nehemiah has learned that the Jerusalem gates are burning, that Jerusalem is utterly in ruin, in absolute devastation. It breaks his heart to learn that that's what's happened to his homeland, to his home people, to his countrymen, and to those that are the dearest to him. And so he can't hide the despair that has fallen on him. When he learns that message, he stops, he mourns, he weeps, he fasts, he prays for many days, the Bible says. Then he comes into the king's presence after this message has been learned and after this news has been conveyed. The king can tell there's something wrong with Nehemiah, so the king asks Nehemiah, "What's wrong? Why is your face so sad?" And Nehemiah stops in the moment, and he doesn't lie to the king. I think that's so critical. He doesn't tell the king, "It's nothing, everything's fine, don't worry about me." He tells the king, "Nothing is going right, it seems, in this moment. Why should I have a happy appearance when I've learned this news about Jerusalem and about the city gates?" And so the king says to Nehemiah, "What do you request?" In other words, he says, "How can I help?" It's in this moment that Nehemiah communicates the urgency. What do you think the level of concern or care was that the king had for the gates in Jerusalem? How high on his priority list do you think the gates burning in Jerusalem made it on the king's list? Anybody? Zero? Anybody have a less than zero? I mean, I don't think you can go less than zero, can you? I think that's pretty well accurate. The king, can we say, could not have cared less about the gates burning in Jerusalem. Who did he care for? Nehemiah. Is this important to Nehemiah? It's important to Nehemiah. Is Nehemiah important to the king? Nehemiah is important to the king. Can the king help Nehemiah? The king can help Nehemiah. Did the sense of urgency come to the king? It did. But this was not the king's sense of urgency. It was Nehemiah's sense of urgency. We think about stopping and praying, communicating that sense of urgency. What are we doing here to deal with and fix this aspect. I want to talk about a couple of other observations that we can make when it comes to navigating difficulties or challenges. Let's spend a moment briefly thinking about how we build an eager coalition. I want to go back to the text of Nehemiah, and I want us to see that as a backdrop once again, thinking about how Nehemiah elicits the help and brings others in. So it's in the text, Nehemiah chapter 1, where you see Nehemiah giving this optic in terms of what's going on in and around the region at this particular moment in time. He's learned of the destruction of Jerusalem's gates. He's learned of all the chaos and all the turmoil that is there. And so when Nehemiah learns this, Nehemiah knows that something has to be done, but Nehemiah also knows that he's not able to do this on his own. He learns of the dilemma and he learns of the problem. The survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Nehemiah learns about the survivors. He learns about their reproach, their distress. He learns about the city itself lying in ruin, being destroyed, burning. He learns about all of this calamity. And now Nehemiah knows something's got to be done, but he can't do it by himself. Remember, one of the aspects of communicating that sense of urgency was for us to communicate with God in prayer and then communicate that with other people. Notice that formula continues on here, and I want you to observe the players that are involved in Nehemiah. Look at chapter 2. Then the king, there's one, the king said to me, "What do you request?" Remember, here's the first thing Nehemiah does. He's been asked, "How can I help?" And so Nehemiah prays to God. Prays to God for what? Well, I think he prays to God for clarity in knowing, how can I answer and respond in this moment? How can I provide in this moment a true response to the king? And so he prays in that moment. "And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Just observe this. In tackling the issue at hand, Nehemiah does this. He elicits everybody who is around him and their support. The king, the queen, chiefly, though, God. And then Nehemiah doesn't neglect to realize this. There are also others who will take part in helping. There's the survivors mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 1, and those who are suffering reproach, and those who are in despair. I mean, how do I incorporate other individuals around me to address the issue that is before me? Think about how we build an eager coalition. I love what Nehemiah does here. He involves and identifies those who have an interest. So there's Artaxerxes. There's the governors. Nehemiah says to the king, "King, would you please write a letter to all the governors of the province around and let them know what it is I'm about to do? And then, King, would you also write to the keeper of the timber forest, Asaph? Would you let him know what I'm about to do, that I'm going to need resources and I'm going to need supplies?" And do you know the king writes all of these letters? Anytime you're applying for a job, oftentimes the future employer will ask you for letters of what? Recommendation. I want a reference. And then not only will they take the references that you have given, what will they do? They'll go and seek and find references, if they're a good employer, potentially references on their own. You can find surely anybody, 2 or 3 folks who will say something decent about you, yes? Let's go find some others who have not been prompted in this regard. Let's see what they have to say. Here Nehemiah says, "King, I need you to write me some letters of reference." These individuals may not have a clue who Nehemiah is, but you better believe they know who Artaxerxes is. And you better believe they hear his voice, and they say, do whatever Nehemiah requests. Offer him whatever he asks. Identify those who have an interest. In the church, there will be occasions and opportunities for us to encounter different aspects of trial, of challenge, of circumstance, and of opportunity. Do we identify those who have a vested interest in all the aforementioned? Do we identify those who have a vested stake in that thing in order to bring them in to the bringing about of whatever it is that's desiring to be accomplished? Notice this, number 2, incorporate those with experience. If you read in Nehemiah chapter 3, Nehemiah finds everyone from woodcutters to goldsmith and everyone in between when it comes to going to do this project. What are the talents that are in the presence of that body that they need to be utilized? Now, think about the talents that lie within any church family and any congregation. And think about how sometimes all of those talents are not always used all the time or all at once. But sometimes there are occasions for individuals with unique and specific talents to definitely be employed to help in the carrying out of a task. Nehemiah incorporated those with experience. He brought them in. For what reason? Well, number 1, Nehemiah couldn't do this thing by himself. And number 2, it was better when there was a total buy-in to whatever it was that was taking place from the broader group. Now all of a sudden you have the goldsmiths and the woodcutters and everyone else believing that the mission of rebuilding Jerusalem is a good idea because they have a stake in what's at hand. They have a thought or a notion in how this will come about. Notice Nehemiah chapter 4 and number 3. Involve those with potential. Involve those who perhaps have had that sideline perspective up to this moment. Maybe they've not been engaged. Nehemiah seems to identify individuals who ultimately will be affected by whether or not Jerusalem is rebuilt, or by whether or not Jerusalem and those who are taken captive are set free, and allowed to return home. Nehemiah brings those in who at first glance may think, what does this have to do with me? Why should I even care about this issue? That has nothing to do whatsoever with me. When we involve individuals that have potential not only for growth and for learning and for opportunity to engage and overcome that idea of disconnect or apathy, we can involve them and they gain this potential of growth and leadership in their own right. Nehemiah, I think, was an outstanding PR man. He was an outstanding marketer. He was an outstanding spokesperson for the sake and for the cause of Israel. He beat the drum for everybody involved to get on board. And they recognized the potential that could be there in order to repair and rebuild Jerusalem. Ultimately, number 4, include the time needed for all. What do we mean by this? Notice that Nehemiah does not first go to the people like the goldsmiths or the woodcutters or others. There's a progression that I think may be subtle, but I think it's very, very essential in this process. He speaks with those power players who can give their voice of influence, and he involves those who have their voice of influence in a very unique way. And then progressively he's building, if you will, this coalition to go out and to take on the task that is at hand. You know, not everybody is always involved or on board with every idea or every concept that has ever been presented as quickly as everybody else would like. Sometimes things move very slowly, very methodically, very intentionally. I read a story of a church in a location in the Northeast. They were vested deeply in their personal heritage. They had a long history together as a church family, so much so that in their own building that was set to be drastically and dramatically remodeled, in the old pews, on the ends of the pews, guess what you found? Nameplates of individuals who had donated money for the purchase of that pew 400,000 years ago. And it has still been and remains that family's pew. All of that was set to be removed. All the pews were going away. They were going to be replaced with a stadium-like chair, if you will. All of the aspects of the aesthetic of the building, it was preparing to be completely redone and revamped. They went through all of the process of having the final meeting to make all of these decisions. They were hiring a new minister. The minister had been there for multiple decades. Others had been on ministry staff, and they were taking in other ministry roles, in fact, replacing the aforementioned long-term tenured minister. All of these changes were taking place. A gentleman came in and observed the family meeting of the church family. It lasted all of 37 minutes, 20 minutes of which was spent in praise and in prayer, in song and in thanksgiving. 4 questions were asked, and all of them points of clarity. None of them were comments of hostility. And everyone left with an absolute delight. When the individual who observed the meeting came to the one who had orchestrated the meeting, he said, "Well done. I can't believe you did that in 37 minutes. He said, "I promise you, this was a formality. I have spent the last 10 months in everyone's home, visiting with them face to face, eyeball to eyeball, talking about these very things, so that this moment in the public eye was not a moment for us to be afraid of." How do you build an eager coalition? Nehemiah went to the king, eyeball to eyeball, but I want you to know this. The king and Nehemiah had a long-standing relationship well before Nehemiah had an ask to make of the king. How do you build an eager coalition? Nehemiah knew who he would need to get this job done, and he went to them, having asked the king for his support. Nehemiah knew who those would be that could bring in their talents to this whole process, and he knew it would be a blessing to everyone. And so Nehemiah communicated all of those things. Church, I don't think that there is a better path to accomplish that kind of opportunity than the path that Scripture establishes, but it also offers insight into how to accomplish it because of the beauty of the nature of what God has said. Here's how you do hard things together. We could speak continuously about the challenges that Nehemiah faced, and we'll observe those a little later. But think about how he built the coalition to address the issue at hand. Can I consider with you this morning, and you consider with me, how that not only do we build an eager coalition, but that together we become a voice and a vision for something greater. Scripture is replete with the idea of hope. I just want you to think about the theme of hope throughout all of the Bible, Old Testament and New. Over and over again, you see the idea of hope communicated. Psalm 38 and 15, "For in you, O Lord, I hope." Psalm 62 and 5, "For my expectation is from Him." Literally, my hope, my certainty is from Him, is from God. Jeremiah says the idea of woe being foreboding in Lamentations chapter 3. He says, "My soul sinks within me, and this one thing I recall to mind. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in Him." Jeremiah doesn't come to that conclusion in Lamentations 3 and verse 1. In Lamentations 3 and verse 1, Jeremiah says, "I'm the man who has seen affliction at the hand of God." It's not until verse 24 that Jeremiah comes along and says, "But God is the only one who can deliver me from the affliction I face, so I hope in Him." Think about Acts 26 and verse 6. It was communicated through the pen of Luke by the preaching of Paul that the preaching of Jesus Christ is for the hope of the promise. Romans 5 and verse 2, we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Hebrews 10 and 23, hold on to the confession of our hope. In Hebrews 6, we're told that Jesus Christ is our anchor. He is our hope that we rest in. In all of these aspects, the message of God is a message of hope. And so if we together as God's people are thinking about how we communicate a message of hope, what does that look like? From the book that I told you the story regarding the idea of the turmoil that came about because someone moved or rearranged the pulpit, and it was a long-standing item of presence in a church facility. They were going through growth. They were experiencing new families coming in. The preaching style of the minister had changed. He was really no longer utilizing the pulpit, so he moved the old one out, brought in a new one that had a more modern, contemporary look, if you will. It really upset the congregants at large because it was such a fixture, the old one that is, of their building and facility. It really was something that just caught them off guard, caught him off guard too when he realized how much pushback came and the lighting up that came his way of people's complaints and their aggravation. So he was ready to make a public apology for doing so. Comes in the next Sunday, the old pulpit is back in the place where the new pulpit had been moved. And so he sort of cries out across the auditorium, "Who moved my pulpit?" It became the point of contention for 2 solid years, navigating through that. He remained for a long period of time after that, but it truly delayed a great opportunity for growth and the goodness of the Lord. A couple of observations to make in further consideration. The church ought to be a voice and vision of hope, and the members ought to share in a voice and vision of hope. One of the challenges that comes in sharing in the voice and vision of hope is whether or not we recognize what's going on in us and around us. So another church in another place was struggling. They were struggling mightily. The minister was tired of ministering, tired of the controversy, tired of the conflict, tired of the problems that seemed to continually be present. And so he was going to just slip away. His family was worn out. They had not been together, seen one another, been able to connect together in some time. They were just exhausted. And so he wasn't even looking for a new place to go. He was just looking to go. And as a result, he communicated that to a few, that ultimately this would be the opportunity. He realized that he was not in the right frame of mind, that his attitude was carrying out into the attitude of the body at large. And so as he was disgruntled, so too was the body disgruntled. As he was frustrated, so too was the body frustrated. As he was agitated, so too was the body agitated. And so he plunged himself into a period of time of prayer and of engagement of the Word, day in and day out. Then he started looking at the ministries going on in the church, perhaps the things that other people didn't see or weren't aware of. He came across this ministry where about 5 elderly individuals had been working a food distribution ministry. Turns out that they were serving around 225 to 250 individuals annually who were without food. They would take them in, they would adopt them, they would sustain them. It wasn't just, we're going to pass out one bag of food here and there and then move on. No, they would take in about 225, 250 or so families, and they would support them throughout the year. He started adding it up. It turned out that somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 families had been served by this ministry in terms of the tenure that the ministry had gone on. He started looking further, that all of the sudden individuals had been brought to the church out of this ministry, and no one really in the church beyond those 4 or 5 folks that worked the ministry knew anything about it. He started highlighting it. He started praising the fire out of that ministry, and all of a sudden everyone else started getting excited about what was going on in that ministry, and they got on board the bandwagon. And then they started thinking about ways they could expand the ministry. They went from 250 or so families per year to more than 1,000 families per year. They changed the name of the ministry. You know what they call the ministry? Hope. Helping other people eternally. Do you know, after a period of a few months, that man's attitude changed, the attitude of the church changed, and their concept of how we do ministry together changed? And it transformed every aspect of their ability to move forward. How do you become a vision for hope? Let me give you some considerations before our time expires on us. Number one, leaders read the Bible daily. If you are struggling in your life, if you are struggling with the idea of how it is you can keep the right attitude, the right frame of mind, the right kind of deportment and disposition toward you, your work, your family, people around you, let me suggest to you that perhaps it is that in your life or in your mind there is not enough of an engagement with the Word, and it thus needs to be more so. There is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, implicit and direct correlation for the causation that when leaders are engaged in reading the Word regularly and daily, the health of the body life of their church families are always measured at higher metrics of being well and healthy than any other. Leaders who read the Bible daily, making it a part of their daily habit, influence and impact the overall attitude and health, that is, of all those involved in the ministry of the church family at large. Number two, leaders choose to communicate hope. Nehemiah's idea of challenge of rebuilding the wall, going back to Jerusalem, delivering the captives, none of that was simple. But Nehemiah comes in as this hopeful voice. I mean, he is so excited and convinced that this thing can happen. Do you remember, did it take less time or more time to rebuild the wall? It took less time. Why? I'm convinced it's because Nehemiah was on the sideline telling people, God is on our side. There's nothing we can't accomplish. There is nothing that will conquer us. We're going to prevail, and it's going to be grand what God does. Leaders choose to communicate a message and an attitude of hope. Number three, leaders look for low-hanging fruit. What do we mean by that? We mean by that this. Leaders look for opportunity to see successes within and among a church family. Where is something that is going on in the church family that few may know about, but it really is a blessing? What does that thing look like? How do we communicate it? How do we tell others about it? How do we let them know this is a good thing that is happening? Leaders don't look to tell you all the things that have gone wrong or haven't gone right, or all the things that used to be good. It's beautiful to be nostalgic and to think about the way things used to be through the lens of reflection. That's a beautiful thing. But if you are using the past as an anchor and not as a guidepost for where you need to be, you are using it in the wrong manner. Leaders look to guide vision. The Bible says, where there is no vision, the plans of the people go awry, or the plans of the people fail. Sometimes we use vision in the sense of being a dreamer for the future. Well, that's a beautiful notion, and I'm not pressing against that or pushing against it. But when the proverb writer says, where there is no vision, the plans of the people fail, he's not talking about a dreamer. He's not talking about someone who can think up fantastic things to do in the future. He's talking about revelation of God. Leaders guide through the vision of God. What does God want us to be doing? Leaders look to guide through the use of vision. How is it that God would have us behave in this place and in this time and in this moment? Leaders look to guide vision. Why would they be qualified to guide vision? I'll tell you why they would be qualified to guide vision. I refer you back to number one on the list. They are spending time daily in the Word. They would be most preeminently qualified to guide vision. Number five, leaders look to strategize vision. Leaders look to think about ways that now we know what vision is looking like, what the direction is we need to travel, and what it is we need to do. And now we're going to develop a strategy for that. I think a beautiful passage that depicts both of these concepts, guiding vision and strategizing vision, can be found in Acts 15. In Acts 15, when there was the problem over the divide of doctrine, and when the church came down together to Jerusalem, and the Judaizing teachers said, don't get all worked up over baptism, just add to it circumcision and it'll be fine. And the church in Jerusalem said, you need to get more worked up over what God has said and done, and not so worked over by your own opinion. They collided together in those moments. And then at the end of that conflict came this consideration, and no concession, but consideration. We're going to be guided by what God has said. We're going to be guided by what God has done. And here's how it looks in Acts 15. The guiding vision is both what the Word says of God's Word and what God has done within His Word. And then the strategy. It's hard enough for people to come to Jesus without us making it harder.